Welcome to the Betsy and Wally Stern Conference Center. I'm John Walters, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. This week marks 1 year since Putin launched his 3-day conquest of Ukraine. Today we are gathered to discuss the war under the title, Keeping Ukraine on the Path to Victory. This is not what Vladimir Putin had in mind when he ordered his military to attack his neighbor. Hudson Institute has a long tradition of studying deterrence. Once Russia's full-scale invasion got underway, our analysts added to their work an additional framework, victory. In opinion pieces on television and the media, through policy analysis, our experts have sought to inform the public and our policymakers on how to achieve that objective, Ukrainian victory, Russian defeat. I trust today's conference, consisting of 2 panels, a special message from Ukraine's Minister of Defense, and briefing from the front line will help in that effort. But first, to kick off, we are delighted to welcome back to Hudson the Ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, Oksana Markarova. Thanks to the President of the United States and his address to the joint session of Congress, the Ambassador no longer needs an introduction. Instead, I'd just like to say thank you for your continued friendship with Hudson. We are impressed every day by the extraordinary courage and persistence demonstrated by the Ukrainian people. It is an honor to have you here. Madam Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, dear President Walters, thank you so much for this kind introduction. I'm really happy and honored to be here with you. It's really friendship, what you said, with Hudson Institute. And I want to thank the Institute for being such a devoted defender of freedom and democracy. In fact, so effective that even Russian war criminal Lavrov pays attention to your conferences on a regular basis. And I really hope they will listen to this one as well. Thank you, dear John, and to all your team, especially to Luke Coffey and to Peter Rao. Thank you for tireless work. And this work is really needed, and for this event as well. As you said yesterday, this week we're approaching the 1-year mark. Yesterday was a remarkable visit of President Biden to Ukraine, to Kyiv. And it has been one more very strong symbol of unwavering support of American people and standing together with us in this fight, which is very important. As we approach this 1-year mark, we, of course, reflect on what we have done right, not to allow Putin to have his 3-day offensive, from our brave President Zelensky to everyone on the front line, to everyone in Ukrainian administration, to all Ukrainians, volunteers, teachers, women, men, but also Americans. You know, the unwavering and unprecedented support from President Biden, from Congress on a very strong bipartisan basis, and literally from every American, has been essential in this fight. Russia's year-long invasion after 9 years of war, which started, as you know, 9 years ago, has also shown that Ukraine is not only capable of defending itself, but it's also a stronghold of democracy. The Kremlin's plans to destroy us has failed, and it wasn't just the plans to destroy Kyiv or Donbass or some parts of Ukraine. It was the plan to destroy our statehood, something that they have done effectively during the previous 400 years. But we will never give up on our freedom. We will never give up on humanity, on respect to individual rights. And we will always follow not only our legislation, but also international legislation. Ukraine, unlike Russia, continues to be the nation that is actually run by people and run for people. And this is what differentiates us, and this is what makes us stronger. So now, what do we need? I mean, we worked a lot together with the expert community, with our friends here, about the needs. And it was always about weapons, sanctions, financial support. You heard me saying it a number of times. But we do need now a very clear and shared strategy of our common victory. This is what we have to be discussing now. We must be ready for the defeat of Russia, and we actually have to start shaping our shared vision of how it would look like. February 24th, again, after 9 years of different stages of war, hybrid war, the hot war in 2014-15, and then all kinds of attacks on our country after that, marks a full-scale invasion. Every year, missiles, atrocities, troops on the ground. Today, as I was coming here to speak, again, received all the horrific pictures from Kherson, where today Russia just indiscreetly shelled a bus stop where 6 people are dead. And you look at these pictures, of like innocent people lying on the streets in the 21st century because somebody decided to simply shoot the Grad missiles over the Dnieper. And it's just another sign of this neo-imperialistic and expansionist ambitions, but it's also a pure war crime, one after another. So again, you said Russian propaganda claimed we would fall in 3 days. In reality, we not only were able to stop the invasion, but we were able also to liberate and free nearly half of what Russia was able to occupy during the first months of the invasion. If we can receive more weapons, if there will be tougher sanctions, if there will be more support to Ukraine, we will do it faster, and we definitely will be able to regain all of our territory within internationally recognized borders. So we have made very clear, and we have been asked a number of times, whether we will be able to give up something in exchange for peace. And we have made very clear that we are not ready to leave our territories, and we are not ready to leave our people at the mercy of the aggressor, because this is something we know, and now the whole world know, Russia does not have mercy. So we will not accept the peace at any cost, but nobody more than Ukraine wants peace. And we work really hard in order to get to that peace. So President Zelensky proposed his peace plan formula, which is very clear, very specific, the 10 steps that would be able to not only achieve just peace for Ukraine, but also lasting peace for our region. This comprehensive formula, which has been discussed widely, includes, of course, regaining our territorial integrity within all our internationally recognized bodies. And yes, we are talking about 1991, when 98% of Ukrainians voted to be independent, and those borders have been accepted by everyone, including Russia. We also are talking about returning all of our people back, especially our children who Russia has stolen and continues to steal. We are talking about accountability and justice. Russia has to be called accountable for everything they've done, from each war crime on our territory, from each war crime that they have committed towards our citizens, not only on our territory, but also for all other crimes, including, which is very important, the crime of aggression. That is why you hear us talking with all of our friends and allies and publicly about the special tribunal. The mother of the crime that started all of this, is the crime of aggression. And Putin and his surroundings have to be held accountable in addition to everyone who does it on the ground. And I just want to close with saying something that people in this audience know, but it's important to repeat it, that this war is not only about Ukraine. That Russia, by this war from 2014, but also in 2022, and continues to do it, as we all heard in Putin's recent speech, continues to destroy a global security and the international order that has been put in place after World War II. So if we want to restore that global order, Ukraine has to win, and Russia has to be defeated for the brutal violation of UN Charter and all pretty much pieces of the international law that have been there. We will continue to fight for our freedom, and we will fight as long as it takes for us to win. And we really count on all of our friends and allies, especially our friend and ally number one, to stand with us as long as it takes. Again, as long as it takes to win. And we can win this war. I think it's clear to everyone, and this is what we have to discuss. We can win this war, and we're very grateful to all of the allies that are supplying us with all the needed help and adopting all the needed sanctions for Russia. if we can do it faster, we can win faster. So I'm sure today's event is yet another great opportunity to hear from so many experts, but also hear from the front line and hear from people from Ukraine, and that together we can join forces and make faster that day when I will be able to come and speak about the lessons, how we learned this war, rather than how bravely we're standing up, because we really, all Ukrainians, um, like to do something different. We like to grow bread. We like to raise our children. We actually is a very peaceful country that never attacked anyone in the past. When we have to defend our homes, I think we have shown to the world how we can do it. But we are all, dreaming about the day when we can put aside our weapons and go back to our plows and everything that is more familiar to us and we like more. So God bless America, glory to Ukraine, and have a great, great, great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. The ambassadors agreed to take some questions. We have a variety of members of the press in the audience and others. So, sir?
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I can't even conceive of this ending without a major program for reparations. And I'm wondering if the world is looking at perhaps a tax on Russian energy for the next 20 years to make that happen. And without reparations, this can never end. You people need to be compensated for what's being done.
Amen. I can only agree with this question, which is not really a question, but something that we work really actively on. So 50 or more % of our energy system is destroyed. Some of the cities literally no longer exist. The city of Mariupol has 90% of the buildings destroyed, and Russians still control that city. City of Kharkiv, it's tens of thousands of buildings, some of them of the historical cultural heritage, some institutions that were not even destroyed by the Nazi Germany during the World War II. The destruction is huge. The losses of people are huge. So the reconstruction is going to be massive, and the compensation is something that is an important part of justice as well. Now, there are several sources as we look at how this could be compensated and what resources could we use in order to rebuild the country and have this compensation mechanism. First is the assets that are sanctioned and seized abroad, including the Russian sovereign asset. It's a difficult discussion, but it's a discussion we are holding in a number of capitals since 24th of February. And I believe if we all join forces together, this could lead to a very plausible result, because this is the money of either Russian Federation or people directly responsible for this. They should be seized and they should be provided to Ukraine. And there is a possibility even after the omnibus has been adopted, and there was the Lindsey Graham law on inside that actually allowed already the prosecutor general with his decision to transfer confiscated assets to the Department of State, and Department of State can give it to Ukraine already. So we already have the first 5.4 million that has been confiscated and is going through that process. But of course, the scale of what is needed is much more. Of course, the reparation is something that we think it would be a just thing to discuss, but it requires us to win the war and Russia to be defeated in order to even approach those discussions. So absolutely. And third, within all these three criminal proceedings that we have in the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, and European Court of Human Rights, as well as future tribunal, the end result of all of these decisions could also and should also lead to, reparations, confiscations, and the material aspect of Russia also paying for what they have done. So absolutely, yes.
Yes, sir. Hold on a second. Let me get the microphone so people can hear you.
Peter Semler, I'm head of Capital Intelligence Group. We have a specialized service called CI Ukraine. The question is also, you as a former deputy finance minister, how important is for private sector investment to mobilize? We have occupied, the south and the eastern Ukraine, but northwest, I was in Lutsk. It was very dynamic. You have very good companies, very good private sector companies. Western investors have been investing even before 2014. After, you have Cargill, you have some other ones. How is your efforts to get that investment mobilized? Get the private sector. You got Caterpillar, who has solar turbines, biggest producer of generators there are. You have Metso from Finland that does forestry. Northwest Ukraine is a forestry. How effective is that, and what are your problems? I think MIGA is going to announce a fund for war insurance. You have DFC, EBRD, and others. I was just wondering how are you getting to that? Thank you.
I'll answer this question not only as ambassador, but also, as you said, as former Minister of Finance, but also as someone who before that spent many years in private equity. So it's impossible. It will be impossible to rebuild Ukraine or build something new, as we say, and build back better, to steal American president's phrase, without massive participation of private sector, regardless of what compensations or reparations or frozen assets we would be able to get to compensate from Russia. We can only quickly rebuild if private sector is actively involved. So this is number one priority. And actually, this is number one priority now. So we have launched this platform, coordinating platform, after military security Ramstein, after energy contact group. A month ago, there was inaugural meeting of the coordination platform for reconstruction, and we call it the financial Ramstein. So first, I'm very grateful to all American and Ukrainian business that actually continues to do business now. And regardless of the full-fledged war, there are so many companies that not only stayed in Ukraine, but continue to pay taxes, continue to pay salaries. We value each of them, and they are such an inseparable and important part of our victory, because in addition to sustaining the war effort, we have to sustain running the country. Second, we're looking already at these areas which are going to be the future growth areas. No surprise, agribusiness, innovations and IT and high tech, all kinds of manufacturing. Also, the military tech, something that is developing rapidly in Ukraine, and we see emerging companies, startups that have their products on the front line today, which are helping us tremendously. So we work already with all the IFIs. MIGA already has provided 2 companies, if I'm not mistaken, with first kind of pilot war insurances. We're trying to widen that and have that project more accessible to business, so that business can start today, not only planning, but even investing and expanding in Ukraine. The demining is a very important aspect of that. We are starting the new planting season right now. And it's necessary. We are the most mined country in the world right now. It's true. So we need to do the demining again as we speak right now, in order to be able not to miss the upcoming agricultural season. But we're working very actively even now with American Chamber of Commerce, with the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, with all type of business associations, and trying to reach out. I probably meet with American companies as much as I meet with people about weapons and everything else. So it is a priority. We are focusing on it. We have the Vice Prime Minister for Reconstruction. Our Minister of Infrastructure has been recently promoted to that position, so that actually, while fighting, we can continue doing that. And because we understand it's important, also please know that while fighting on the front line, we also continue to do the reforms. So I know it's not something that I has been talking a lot, spending 90% of my times again on sanctions, financial support, and weapons. But during this year, we continued, we finalized the selection of the anti-corruption prosecutor. We are doing the court system reforms as we speak. One of my people that I personally know, a judge who volunteered and went on the front lines and fought actually in the active combat, had to return because he's part of the selection committee for the judges. So he's doing that until he can. We are doing that because we understand that creating level playing field is very important for business to come back or expand as soon as possible. And because we understand that we have to win the war, but we also have to win the peace. We have to show that we can not only defend ourselves, and actually it's what democracies have to show to everyone, that democracies can not only, here in the West, we know that democracies can deliver better to the people, but now we have to show that democracies can defend themselves. In Ukraine, we know we are showing that we can defend themselves, but we also will have to show after we win that we can deliver to our people.
Yes, sir, in the back.
With FGI Solutions. Thank you very much for coming in today. This is great. We are a procurement and logistics company. We're doing some work in Ukraine at this point. One of the big questions that keeps coming up is the issue of corruption. And I know there's been a number of efforts by Ukraine to address this. And I just wonder if you could kind of outline what's going on in that regards.
Thank you. So, as the former Minister of Finance in 2014 and 15, when we started reforming the country, and it was, again, during the time when the war started. It wasn't a full-fledged war. My line that I was talking, when I was talking to business, was like, we have war, but it's 5% of Ukraine's territory and 95% is open for business. But we also realized from the beginning, because it was after years of vested interest running Ukraine, the Russian influences everywhere in Ukraine, the country was rock blind, literally. In 2014, there was a moment in time when we had 10,000 euros on our single treasury account of the whole country of 40 million people. So with regard to corruption, there were two approaches that we took during the past 9 years, and it's actually no different now. First is to shrink and decrease the space for corruption, to prevent corruption. So to introduce Prozoro, to do the very public and transparent procurement rules, to put all the data about the public expenditures online, something that I have done, to deregulate completely the gas and energy system, to join to the European NSOE and other rules in order to have a more transparent system in energy. Because when Russia was dominating in Ukraine before 2013, this was one of the sectors where to also massively privatize, because the Ukrainian public sector was still too big. Now, we didn't have time to complete all of that before, but we still are working in that direction. And you see that the corporate governance, even during the war, we just elected 2 new supervisory boards for some state-owned banks and for Naftogaz, the largest company. So this prevention of corruption and limiting the space for corruption is still important. And we even discussing now, because when the war started, we had to close some access to information for security purposes, but we are opening it back now, even during the war. Whatever is not directly linked to security and to the battlefield should be open for the public so that public can control. The second big part is actually combating corruption. And Ukraine has created a whole infrastructure to specifically target the high-level corruption. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau, National Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office now, and the National Anti-Corruption Court. And during the past years, they have been quite effective in targeting these high-level corruption cases. Now, is everything ideal? Of course not. It will take time. Plus, this special anti-corruption infrastructure only targets a high-level corruption, while the majority of businesses and people deal with the ordinary courts. That's why the court reform is so important. And this is probably the most difficult reform, because it requires almost like generational changes. It requires us to put not only right laws and regulations in place, but also go through the process of the right people, good judges staying in place, and the bad ones at some point, being analyzed by their peers and the whole system that is placed there. So is there a zero corruption in Ukraine? Definitely not. But I can assure you that there is a zero tolerance to corruption. From President Zelensky, who's very public about it, even during the wartime, to everyone in the team. So we will work hard in order to continue a fight with it. But again, having a compliant business, investing more in Ukraine, is something that will help with it more than sometimes just talking about it. Because the more compliant companies we will have on the ground, which will only work according to the transparent rules, the more we deepen the decentralization, which has been a very effective reform in Ukraine. Because right now, the local administrations, which have a big portion of the taxation and revenues, they actually demand, they invite companies to come, but they also demand fair rules to be there. So it's a difficult topic about which we are ready to be very public, we are ready to discuss, and similar on all the assistance that we are receiving. You probably saw the statement by the Treasury and the Inspector Generals who have been in Ukraine and are doing their work here on the permanent basis, that there was no evidence of any type of either mismanagement or anything with the support that we have been receiving from the US, but also from other European friends and allies. We are reporting on a budget assistance, literally on every dollar, when we have received it, when we have exchanged it into hryvnia, and what accounts it was used to pay, and similar with the security assistance and everything else. And we will continue doing so.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Irina Palishvili, Chair of Legal Committee of U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. Madam Ambassador, how important is EU candidacy status of Ukraine for winning the peace, for rebuilding Ukraine, for all the reforms that you were mentioning? Thank you.
Well, very important. As you remember, the Revolution of Dignity started in 2013 when then President Yanukovych, who was owned by the Kremlin, decided to turn around from going into European Association Agreement and again have some kind of closer ties with Russia. And that's when the people of Ukraine said no. Because for us, this European aspiration and Euro-Atlantic aspiration is something where we would like to go back to. This is who we are. This is the principles and values we share. And it was so important that people even went on the streets and protested against it. And fighting for European values has been something that we did on Maidan and something that we are doing now in the battlefield for the past 9 years, and especially during this year. So the fact that European Union and European countries have given us a candidate status has been such a light at the end of the tunnel for all Ukrainians, which not only proven that we want to be part of Europe, but also that Europe wants to be part of them. I see my friend ambassador from Estonia here, and thank you for all the efforts in this regard and for being such a true friend. But it's very important because it's also a blueprint of the regulations and rules and everything that while the path towards European membership is as important as the membership itself. So when we talk about deregulation, combating corruption, free and fair judiciary, it's all in our association agreement and it's all in our candidacy right now papers. So while moving closer to the European Union, we will be reforming also our country. So I'm sure that there will be soon one day when we will become member of the European Union, but we're building Europe in Ukraine right now, even before we will be a full member of the European Union.
Well, as you can imagine, the ambassador has many rounds to make today, so I want to thank her for joining us. And I want to invite everybody one more time to thank you for your service, your ally, an ally of the United States. We hope we maintain that friendship and we get to victory soon. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you. So much.
Pause for just a couple of minutes to let, I think, some of the television cameras are leaving.
and then we will resume. So it'll just be a couple minutes pause. Thanks.
Specifically for me. Okay. Well, nice to meet you again.
Hello?
Right, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I do remember. Good to see you. Yeah. Yeah. I was on the break here for another thing today. I just sort of. They were pretty hostile. You don't think so? Oh, right. Never. They didn't like it when I said international law. They were like, whoa! Right, that's right. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's when Christmas is over and kind of like people are getting bored and it's dark and you know somebody's gonna do something crazy.
Someone made us like.
Yeah, the summer things are nice. Yeah. I am absolutely convinced it's just sort of big world changing altogether. Mostly the result of war. You know, like I even think like because it's February. You know, it's like we're like Americans. You know. Yeah, that's true. It's still windy. Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, it's because it's winter. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, especially I know, good to see you. Oh, okay.
All right, I think we're ready to continue with the program. If people could take their seats, please. Thank you.
All right, we're going to kick off with the rest of our program after those fantastic remarks by the ambassador. I want to welcome again everyone here to the Hudson Institute, your excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and friends of Ukraine. We have a great lineup for the rest of the day, and we're going to kick off by going to the front lines of the fight in Ukraine before we continue with the rest of the program. It is with great honor and privilege that I can introduce Commander Mamuka Mamulashvili. Commander Mamulashvili is the commander of the Georgian National Legion in Ukraine. He's calling in from the front lines. I'm guessing he's not going to say exactly where, since there are many Russians who probably want him dead. But he is taking time out of his very busy schedule to speak with us today, to give us an account on how he sees the situation from his point of view as a frontline commander. Mamuka, he has dedicated his whole life to freedom and liberty and security. He has one of the most interesting backgrounds of anyone you'll ever come across. I'm surprised that Netflix or Amazon Prime hasn't contacted him to write his life story. He first became a Russian prisoner of war at age 14 in Abkhazia in the 1990s, where he was fighting alongside his father. And in 2014, when we saw the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, he rushed to Ukraine from Georgia, where he established the Georgian Legion, which he'll tell you more about here in a second. And he's been fighting for the Ukrainian people, for his Georgian countrymen, basically fighting for all of us ever since 2014. So that's why we're so lucky to have him here today. Mamuka, welcome, Gambajoba. So great to see you here.
Hello. Great that you invited me. I'm very thankful, and thank you to the audience. It's a big honor for me to speak with participants. Generally, it's here to discuss ongoing processes, what's happening right now on front. So you can ask any questions. I'll try to answer them.
Great, and I just want to remind the audience that Mamuka is calling in from the front lines. So if the connection is a little staticky, I'm sure you'll give some leeway for that. Mamuka, can you tell us, for those in the audience or those watching online who may not know about the Georgian Legion, what should they know? What would you like to tell them?
Georgian Legion is a unit that was created by me in 2014 just to help Ukrainians, because we all Ukrainians. Ukrainians were the only people in 90s that helped Georgians during the Russian aggression in 90s. So Ukrainians made a volunteer battalion that did a great job for Georgia, for Georgian sovereignty. And of course, so it's not surprising for anyone that Georgians are present at the front lines today, and that we are supporting Ukraine, but globally we are supporting the democracy and freedom to be provided for everybody who deserves it. So we're trying as soldiers to do our job, and most of the job is done by Ukrainians who are paying blood and flesh for democratic values.
And what can you tell us about the Legion in terms of how many people are in the Georgian Legion, from what countries, and what kind of missions does the Legion do?
The Georgian Legion from the very beginning was a part of a special operation team. Georgian Legion was helping to instruct back in 2014 Ukrainian battalions, brigades. We trained a lot of brigades and battalions. And today, Georgian Legion is one of the largest foreign formation within the Ukrainian army. We are a part of the Ukrainian army, and we are honored to be a part of the army that has given, that took a challenge to fight the biggest terroristic state. So Georgian Legion is not only Georgians are in the Georgian Legion, there are more than 30 different nationalities. And there are guys just who came ideologically to support Ukraine, to support us, and to stand against evil. So most of the Georgian Legion squads are doing special operations on the front line, or even now while we are speaking. And we are specialized in special operations and on intelligence.
And what can you tell us about what you're doing now and where you are now and what the situation is like? Obviously, you can't go into many precise details, but I think the audience would be interested to learn what the current situation is like on the ground. We keep hearing about the Russian offensive that's going to start. In your opinion, has it already started? What do you think is the next few months will be like?
The most intensive phase of the war has not started yet. And we are getting ready. Russians are getting ready to try to occupy more Ukrainian territories. And the situation is getting tense day to day. So now we are all getting ready for what might happen, because I was listening to the speech of Putin today, and I understood that the terroristic state is not going to stop until they get the freedom of the neighbor. So we're not going to give the freedom to terrorists.
And what is the morale like, not only among your fellow soldiers, but amongst the Ukrainian people?
Ukraine has a strong leader today, and Ukraine has motivated people. Soldiers are motivated, of course, to defend their homes, to defend their families, their kids, and their wives. And of course, the morale is very high, and people are motivated to defend everything they have in their lives. And the most important, to defend their freedom. So every Ukrainian is ready to give a fight to any conqueror who is going to do one more attack on Ukraine.
And I know that in addition to the bravery and the sacrifices made by the Georgian Legion on the front line, the Legion has also played an important humanitarian role in this conflict. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Besides doing military missions, we are trying to provide humanitarian aid to local population. Unfortunately, our medics are working very hard daily to save civilian lives, because Russian artillery, as usually, is targeting populated areas, and a lot of civilians are injured during the shelling. So we are trying now to do maximum to protect civilian people. That's why Ukraine needs more air defense systems and needs more weapons to defend itself and to defend democracy.
And I know we're here to talk about Ukraine, but of course, your native country, Georgia, has been suffering an ongoing Russian occupation since 2008, comprising of about 20% of Georgia's internationally recognized territory. And I know from speaking to you in the past, Mamuka, you see your fight in Ukraine as being a key part of someday seeing Georgia liberated from the Russian occupation. What are your views about Russia's military presence in Georgia right now, and how do you see the war in Ukraine connected with what's happening in Georgia?
Georgian territory is occupied for 20% of Georgian territory is occupied by Russia last 30 years. That's what we were fighting for before Ukraine. And unfortunately, today we are facing the fact that Georgian government is also occupied by Russia. Georgian government actually does everything what Kremlin said. I watched the comment of Prime Minister of Georgia, so it was really bad looking for Georgia as a state. So unfortunately, we are facing this fact. Unfortunately, guys who are defending Ukraine today, ethnical Georgians, are also under a big threat because Georgian government made a statement that they want the Georgians who fight for Ukraine to leave Georgian citizenship. And that was said by Prime Minister of Georgia. So we just clearly understand that our political government, Georgian political government, is occupied by Russians.
And before I ask the audience if they have any questions, I have one final general question about the future of Russia. How do you see this ending? How do you see the war in Ukraine being brought to an end, Russia's occupation of Georgia being ended, and the future of the Russian Federation?
Everything depends on the results, what is going to happen in Ukraine. And I'm sure we are going to win this war. We are going to deoccupy Ukraine. And of course, after we will deoccupy Georgia. Georgia is in quite big trouble due to present government that it has. Georgia has not supported sanctions against Russia. And unfortunately, that is the fact. Of course, our dream is to liberate Georgia, but it is the will of society. We're going to do it politically or military way. So we are just a part of Georgian society as a part of Ukrainian society.
Great, thank you. Now, to the audience, it's not every day you get an opportunity to ask a frontline commander a question on the front, the military front of Ukraine. So, if there are any questions, please raise your hand. But be mindful that he might be limited in how he answers your question because he will not want to give too much information away. But if you raise your hand, the lady in the back, if someone could bring a microphone to her, Mamuka, we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. If you could please,
Sure.
great. If you could introduce yourself and your name, that would be great. Thank you.
Mamuka Commander. My name is Rima Rusnak. I'm an intern at Hudson. As you said, it is a great opportunity for me to say hello. And I am a member of the US military, as well as I'm a Moldovan expat. So with a great honor, I salute you and honor you as a citizen arms, but also someone from Moldova, as you know. It's a trifecta of sister states that we fight Russia's aggression for years now. I would like to know, in your opinion, your professional opinion, what is the level of preparedness of the Russian troops compared to the Ukrainian troops? And I think we all have been surprised by the Ukrainian resolve to fight this war. What do you think accounts for that? And last but not least, Slava Ukraini.
Right. Mamuka, could you hear that? Could you hear the question?
Yes, I heard. I hope I heard all the questions. Okay, so about the level of Russian troops, I would say from the beginning, the quality of Russian troops was way better than it is now. And the main, let's say, power of Russian army has been destroyed in the beginning of the war. Of course, Russia is mobilizing more criminals. Russia is mobilizing more mercenaries. Russia is mobilizing more citizens of a terroristic country that are terrorists themselves. So, due to Ukrainian right frontline politics, Ukraine has kept the main professional forces. And of course, today we are ready to meet any enemy. And as I said, the quality of Russian troops is getting lower and lower every day. But terroristic country is sending them wave by wave, even now while we are speaking.
Thank you. Paul.
Hey. Is it okay? Great. Hey, Commander Mamuka, this is Paul Massaro. Good to see you, pal. For those who don't know, I was underway in Ukraine with Commander Mamuka. I think finally my beard has outgrown his. I was clean shaven back then. But in any case, Commander, I'm curious as to your reflections on President Biden's visit to Ukraine yesterday and generally how the West has responded, what has been good and what has been bad.
Oh, hello, my good friend. Paul is the one who visited us at the front line, and it's a great honor for me to meet Paul. Guys, I just don't see you on the screen, I just hear you. So, I would say from the beginning of full-scale war, on 24th of February, the biggest motivation for me was that President Zelensky was present with us actually in Kiev, and it was a big motivation for population, for soldiers, and for everybody that he was present and he was with us. Yesterday's visit of Biden was the same motivation for population of Ukraine. We did not expect it really, and it gave motivation for, I'm sure, for every Ukrainian. It was a step that has shown that the United States are standing with Ukraine and will support Ukraine till the end of this war.
Great. We have time for one final question. The gentleman in the back in the white shirt.
Hello, Commander. Doug Brooks with FGI Solutions. We do logistics and procurement. We've been supporting Ukraine as best we can. My question is, are you seeing all the support, private and public support, reaching the front lines?
Of course, the Western support generally is very important. Of course, we see the presence of it on the front line, but I would say we need a way more weapon, we need a way more ammunition, and it is very important to be done on time. So we're waiting for more ammunition right now.
Great. Mamuka, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule. I know when we arranged this call, you said you were somewhere in the East. So I think we can all use our imagination on where that probably is. We wish you and your soldiers Godspeed and the best of luck and victory. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, and thank you for following our work. Thanks to the United States and all allied countries.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Yeah. I don't see any problem with this Starlink. Yeah, this Starlink worked. This is good. All right. So we're going to continue with our program today. We have a special message from the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Alexei Reznikov, which we will play now. And then we'll kick off with our first panel.
To begin with, I would like to thank the Hudson Institute for organizing this event and for giving me the opportunity to address this esteemed audience. It has been 9 years since the beginning of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, when it occupied Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions in the east. It has also been a year since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. During this stage of the war, the Russians have used every type of weapon except the nukes against Ukraine. It has been an extremely difficult year. To chart the path to victory, let's remember what happened a year ago. Many respected figures in the West believed that Kyiv would fall within 3 days, followed by Ukraine's defeat within a couple of weeks. They acted based on this false assumption. But the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian nation had proven stronger than many expected. Now, the most important question of the agenda at various platforms is, what should Ukraine's victory look like? Russia's strategic defeat is self-evident to everybody. A year ago, the support we received were weapons for guerrilla resistance. Now, our defenders are training on Patriot systems. We are expecting the arrival of the first tanks from Europe next week. We have received hundreds of artillery units, dozens of MLRS systems, anti-ship and anti-radar missiles, air defense systems, and huge quantities of other weaponry. Ukrainian army has de facto became a NATO army, achieving almost complete interoperability. The USA is an uncontested leader in terms of providing assistance. Ukrainians deeply appreciate the support from the American nation. We will never forget this. Almost every type of assistance that Ukraine had asked for as a preventative measure to avert the big war has been implemented by now. A year ago, we suggested that Nord Stream 2 should be stopped. Russian oil should be sanctioned. Russia should be switched off from SWIFT. And Russian vessels should be banned from every port of the free world. It has all been done now. Now we can see which measures have worked and which didn't. Don't provoke the Russians strategy, which has been in place since 2007, didn't work. When implemented after the fact, containment measures are not sufficiently effective and cause colossal casualties. Europe is now dealing with a conventional war, the likes of which the continent has not seen in more than 80 years. The front is almost 2,500 kilometers or 1,500 miles, along with the active combat continuing along the stretch of more than 800 kilometers or 500 miles. The Kremlin is regularly attacking peaceful cities across the entire Ukraine with missiles. Poland, Moldova, and Romania are also under a direct missile threat. Russian mines in the Black Sea pose a direct threat to Bulgaria, Turkey, and the freedom of navigation as such. Many experts had spent years persuading their listeners that a war of this kind in Europe was virtually impossible. This is why it caught everyone underprepared. Some of my European colleagues took stock of the real state of their armies and ended up disappointed. What they are trying to do now essentially amounts to resuscitation measures. The battlefield spreads to cyberspace and information space. The Kremlin has weaponized food, supplies, energy streams of migrants and other factors. International institutions have been proven impotent. The OSCE has essentially disappeared. A terrorist state that is committing a genocide sits on the UN Security Council and has the right of veto. This is absurd. This war has also demonstrated the limits of the NATO's effectiveness. We are deeply grateful to NATO for helping Ukraine. Sweden's and Finland's desire to join the NATO demonstrates that the collective defensive system against Russia is needed. At the same time, it raises the question, to what extent is the NATO capable of using its leverage? It needs a consensus to pass a decision. Even one country that depends on the Kremlin could undermine its unity. To sum up, Russia is destroying not just the world order established after World War II, it's also trying to rewrite the results of the Cold War in which the Soviet monster had been defeated. We have seen Russia essentially annex Belarus and actively develop its military and technical cooperation with the Iran. Iranian drones, which are now being perfected on the battlefield, have a 1,000 kilometer or 6 miles range. There is an open question of where they might hit next or in whose hands they might end up. Lately, we have been hearing more claims that the Kremlin might receive support from the other great powers that don't belong to the free world. A year into the war, Americans have experienced a certain fatigue. They are asking why they should support Ukraine. That is only natural. The answer is simple. Despite what the Kremlin has been trying to tell everyone, this is not a conflict between two Slavic countries. This is an existential conflict between the free world and the world of unfreedom. Unless the enemy is defeated in Ukraine, the conflict will spread. The whole world is watching closely to see the consequences of this war. If there is any indication that the tactic of armed aggression against a sovereign state works, military threats around the globe will increase in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, in the Balkans. This will mean new catastrophic upheavals, more refugees, and global threat to the whole planet. Ukraine's victory will be the victory of the values that have made the US a global leader. Russia's victory would bring huge risks and huge burden, including economic implications. What has worked last year? First and foremost, the Ramstein format developed thanks to the United States leadership. It worked as a values-based alliance that was ready to act. Thanks to Ramstein, we have developed a model to support Ukraine and strengthen the unity of the free world. Ukraine has already become a success story on the battlefield. In a year, the Russian army has lost 10 times more soldiers in Ukraine than Soviet did in 10 years in Afghanistan. A larger part of its professional army has been destroyed. It lost a vast portion of its paratroopers and marines. It lost nearly 300 planes and as many helicopters, approximately 10,000 armored vehicles and tanks. For the first time in a century, Russia lost the flagship of its fleet. This is our joint success. This is proportionally decreases the risks for Europe. Ukraine has become Europe's effective shield in the East. We can chart the path to victory based on what has worked. First, we need to acknowledge that one cannot act ex post facto in this war. The enemy doesn't play by the rules. Russia's main goal is to destroy all rules and impose its own. We need to think ahead and seize the strategic initiative. Second, everybody needs to acknowledge that the Ukrainian nation will not accept any scenario that entails the loss of territories. Such scenarios will not bring peace. They will cause destabilization and chaos. Ukraine is fighting for its freedom and independence. A defeat will mean not just a loss of statehood, it will mean physical extermination of Ukrainians. Russians are already committing genocide. They have already killed tens of thousands of civilians, including women and children. This means that we will fight until victory. The only possible question is how do we liberate all the temporarily occupied territories? In order to do so, we need weapons and ammunition. We need more artillery, air and missile defense systems, tanks, planes, long-range weapons, and we need them as soon as possible. There is no need for delays. These decisions will be made in any case. There is no doubt about that. Only a defeat on the battlefield will force Russia to seek a meaningful peace. The Kremlin's defeat will also demonstrate the world that aggression doesn't work. Third, we recognize that we will need support not just during the war, but also during reconstruction. Assuring our partners trust is of the paramount importance here. This is why we continue the reforms and keep the increasing transparency even during the war. For example, we have introduced the log-fast service used by the NATO to track and control international help. Our partners have full access to the information at any time. We are stepping up our efforts in this sphere and reforming the defense procurement system. We will develop a model similar to the one used by the NATO states. Fourth, Russians need to be shown a way out of the war. They should not be allowed to harbor any illusions. They need to acknowledge that they will face responsibility for their actions, that they will have to retreat from all the territories they have seized, that they will have to pay reparations, that war criminals will be punished. The only thing that is unclear is the time frame, and the longer it lasts, the higher the cost for them. The free world must be united and unwavering in this position. I have spent 2 years negotiating with the Russians, and I know their tactics. If they are allowed an illusion that they might overpower or intimidate their opponents, for example, by making use of their inner divisions, they will bluff and stall for time. Now is the time to create an international tribunal and to step up the sanctions. Russians need to understand clearly that there is no returning to the civilized world for them as long as they are ruled by the terrorist regime. They need to change. The free world turned out to be much stronger than it expected. The Kremlin has been trying to persuade everyone that they would freeze this winter. And here we are, a week away from the spring. Unity and acting ahead is the path to victory. I have no doubt that we will walk this path. Thank you for your attention. Slava Ukraini!
All right, miraculously, we're actually on time. So that means you all are allowed a 5-minute break while we rearrange the stage, and then we'll begin panel one. Thanks so much. All right, if you could slowly wind your way back to your seats, we will begin with the next panel. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first panel. It's going to be hard to top those dynamite speeches that we just heard, but we'll do our best to liven up the conversation and contribute something to this conversation. I'd like to thank Luke Coffey, my colleague, who did the lion's share of the work in putting this on. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson and direct our Center on Europe and Eurasia. When Luke and I began thinking about what to do for the anniversary of the war, we were insistent that we would try to put on a forward-looking program. There are many, I think, op-eds going to be written in the coming days or published, they're probably already written, that say 1 year ago today, comma, XYZ. And we thought we would try to look forward and frame around this concept of what it would mean for Ukraine to achieve victory, as our president and CEO, John Walters, put it in his introduction. So we have two panels. The first is on 2023, not 2022, so the year ahead, and where we might go. And then the second panel, which we think is sort of unique and idiosyncratic, and all the talk of the town, not the panel necessarily, but the issue, and that is Crimea and all the dimensions around Crimea in the war. I'm thrilled to have three fantastic colleagues on stage with me here today. To my far left is Nolan Peterson. Nolan first did a Hudson panel with me about a year ago, almost to the day, and we had a difficulty challenging scheduling it because Nolan at the time was trying to evacuate his wife out of Kyiv, out of Ukraine. He lives in the Ukraine, but is an American, in fact, the former U.S. Air Force Special Operations pilot. He's a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq. You might probably know him as a senior editor for Coffee or Die magazine, also the author of Why Soldiers Miss War, and a prolific writer and conflict journalist. Nolan has an adventuresome spirit. He's been to all 7 continents, which is, if you ever play that game, Two Truths, One Lie, it's a fantastic truth to launch. To his left is Melinda Herring, who's a director of stakeholder relations and social impact at Superhumans. This is a Ukrainian medical center for war injured. They do reconstruction, prosthetics, and rehabilitation, both for children and adults. So a rather sad organization, but I'm sure also uplifting to see the spirit of these injured Ukrainians. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. And I believe she is what the kids call an OG, because she's been interested in Ukraine long before 2014, long before the war broke out. She edited the Atlantic Council's Ukraine blog, Ukraine Alert blog, which was, I think, its most popular flagship publication. She's written on Ukrainian IDPs. She's the vice chair of the board of East Europe Foundation in Kyiv and also a member of the supervisory board of Right to Protection in Kyiv. She's worked at NDI and Freedom House, and in that capacity has done a lot in the democracy space and published a lot in democracy studies. Paul Massaro, to my immediate left, is a well-known face in Washington, although he's trying to disguise himself with that beard. He must be ashamed of things he's said and written, but he is the senior policy advisor for counter-corruption and sanctions at the Helsinki Commission. He's here in a private capacity today as a foreign policy analyst. He also helped facilitate the founding of the Congressional Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy and the Interparliamentary Alliance Against Kleptocracy. Paul is a proud Marylander and has done all of his education at the University of Maryland. Go Terps. So there we have it. Nolan actually has prepared a few remarks. We're actually thrilled that you're here today because ordinarily you'd be in the Ukraine. You're here a bit longer, so we snagged the opportunity to have you live and in the flesh. And we look forward to hearing you and then our fellow panelists with an opening round, and then we'll have a Q&A for the balance of the hour. Go ahead, Nolan. The floor is yours.
First of all, thank you, Luke Coffey, for inviting me to be here today. It's an honor to speak at this event alongside such distinguished colleagues and company. And it's great to be back in the United States after what's been a very tough year. On the evening of February 25th last year, I was in a bomb shelter in Kyiv. And outside, you could hear the sounds of a battle on the city's outskirts. Yet it was strangely quiet inside that underground space, even though it was crammed with hundreds of people, young and old, including many children. But there was one sound that stood out from the silence. It came from people's smartphones as they listened over and over again to a speech by President Vladimir Zelensky declaring that he would not leave the city. In that moment, I knew that Russia had already lost and that Ukraine had already won. Even if the Russians had taken Kyiv, even if the Ukrainian army had been defeated, even if the West had never stepped up and armed Ukraine, no matter what, we would still be here today commemorating the first anniversary of a war that has not yet ended. Since 2014, when I first arrived in Ukraine, I've witnessed how Ukrainians' pursuit of their democratic dreams has laid the groundwork for their resistance to Russia's full-scale invasion. This past year confirmed what I already knew, that Russia cannot destroy Ukrainians' will to resist. And now, as we look ahead to 2023 and what will surely be another tough year, it remains clear to me that Russia has no path toward achieving its political objectives in Ukraine. Recent polling shows that an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians reject making territorial concessions to end the war. But when it comes to victory, Ukrainians care about more than just lines on a map. They care about liberating millions of their fellow citizens who now live under Moscow's brutal occupation. And each new Russian atrocity reinforces that resolve. Ukrainians aren't just fighting for their freedom. They are fighting for their survival. And it's hard to fathom making concessions to an enemy that is committing a genocide against your own people. Ukrainians have the will to fight. They proved that 9 years ago when protesters braved sniper fire to set their country on an irreversible path toward democracy and a divorce from Russia. The 2014 Revolution of Dignity kickstarted many of the societal changes that Ukraine needed to make in order to survive this past year. The revolution sparked the development of Ukraine's spirit of innovation, independent thinking, and entrepreneurship, qualities that transformed civil society as well as the military, giving soldiers the agency to innovate new tactics and techniques, and to have the flexibility to rapidly field a mix of Western weapons. Russia's 2014 invasion of the Donbass and the ensuing 8 years of limited warfare also prepared Ukrainians for the full-scale war. After 2014, Ukraine's military aimed to ditch the rigid Soviet-style chain of command in favor of a Western model, which pushes tactical decision-making down to frontline personnel. Those changes paid huge dividends this year, allowing Ukraine's combat leaders, including its pilots, to make their own decisions based on battlefield realities, rather than taking play-by-play orders from some faraway commander, like the Russians do. The spirit of volunteerism among Ukraine's civilians, which saved their country from disaster in 2014, also kicked into overdrive when the full-scale war began. Literally overnight, Ukraine's civil society mobilized to support the war effort. In particular, Ukraine's combat veterans were instrumental in holding the country together. Many rejoined the regular army. Others served in territorial defense units or spearheaded volunteer operations. On February 4th last year, my friend Alexander Makov, a journalist and combat veteran of the Donbass, told me, "My war never ended. It's just been on pause." He reported for duty on February 24th, and he died in combat near Izium on May 4th. His bereaved fiancée then enlisted and is currently serving on the front lines. For years, combat was limited to the static front lines in the Donbass. But the full-scale war changed all that. No corner of Ukraine is spared from Russia's invasion, and it's an all-hands-on-deck effort to defend the homeland. As a 9-year resident of Kyiv and the proud husband to a Ukrainian wife, I've lived through this war with my friends and family. I've lost many friends who bravely defended their country, and I've met countless civilians who've endured unimaginable trials and tragedies. In this war, I enjoyed no quarantine between the front lines and home. I listened to gun battles and artillery from my living room. I saw tracers cut across the sky from my balcony. And I had to grab my wife's arm, yank her from bed, and sprint to a bomb shelter while Russian cruise missiles impacted our neighborhood, just a few blocks away. Above all, I'll never forget the horrors I observed in Bucha, Irpin, and other areas around Kyiv right after the Russian retreat. The criminality of Russia's war is clear, and so is the moral justice of Ukraine's cause. And for my part, I'm honored to be among Ukrainians and to stand on the side of the good. This war isn't over, but its opening chapter has ended. Everything that happens next will happen because Ukrainians, inspired by values that we all share, bootstrapped a fighting force that defied Russia and won the world's respect. Ukraine will win. But now it's up to us in the West to shorten the timeline of that victory and save countless lives in the long run by providing Kyiv with the weapons and hardware it needs today to get the job done.
Please, Melinda, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
It's on.
It's on. Super. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I have never met this man, but that was, we've just tweeted at each other on and off. So thank you for bringing us together. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. So I am an American, but I am here to tell you what Ukrainian civil society is doing. And I'm going to steal Nolan's phrase that Ukrainians are bootstrapping their way toward victory. I like that very much. So we are building a world-class medical facility in Lviv, Ukraine, in the middle of a war. And that's a crazy idea. It is the ultimate act of faith in defiance. We believe that Ukraine is going to succeed. And this is a feeling that you feel in all parts of society. So we are bringing expertise from Israel, Germany, and the United States to build a hospital that will provide prosthetics for children, for war victims, for men and women. And it's a growing need, unfortunately. More than 10,000 people need complex surgeries and prosthetic limbs. And the kinds of limbs that the Ukrainian government are providing are not, some of them are okay, but a lot of them are just jaw-dropping. When you're offered a piece of arm or a piece of wood that to function as an arm, I don't know how you get back to your life. So that's why civil society and the Ukrainian business community has stepped in a big way and said, there's a huge need. They remember back after World War II when veterans were shuttered off and not part of life, and they were told to sort of make the best of it. It's not going to be that way anymore. The Ukrainian civil society and the state itself has said that you are part of our society. Our society has changed, but we are reimagining what it means to be Ukrainian. So that's part of the vision that we have. Ukraine is going to be a new, interesting, dynamic European society once the war is over. And I am actually optimistic. I don't know that it's going to be over by the end of the year. Nolan and Lieutenant General Ben Hodges will have a better estimate on that as guys who are running around. But I am optimistic about Ukrainians' ability to resist and also their ability to rebuild now. So I'm sure many of you saw the photos on Twitter today of the pictures where we were a year ago in Bucha versus where we are now. That's the bootstrapping spirit that Nolan just spoke about. Ukrainians aren't going to sit around and wait for a grant. They're going to get their screwdrivers out and their drills out and fix things now. So I see a lot of effort on prosthetics that we're personally involved in. We're opening in April. This is not a pipe dream, right? You turn on the news and the war is still heavily fought. We're opening a world-class hospital that's going to start rebuilding people life by life in April. We're not the only one. There's going to be other efforts as well. I also see a great effort on landmines. So Ukraine is or will be the most heavily landmine country in the world when this is over. And we really need the donor community to pay attention to this. I have an 8-year-old child, and now there's something called butterflies. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but they're little pieces of shrapnel, and they look pretty. And I can see my daughter wanting to grab that, and it removes fingers and limbs very quickly. The Russians keep experimenting with the sort of explosive devices they have. We need more awareness of what these look like, and we need to get rid of them as soon as possible. It's going to take a huge village and then some to get rid of the landmine problem. On education, I really, really worry. So Ukraine has an enormous task. A lot of Europeans are obsessed with the task of reconstruction. We Americans are obsessed with winning the war, and that's a good division of labor. But there's some other things to worry about. So Ukraine has gone through 2 years of COVID, like the rest of us, and there's massive delays, right? But then they've underwent a year of education online in the middle of war, and the internet connection is spotty. If you do not have a basement, a proper a proper bomb shelter in your school is closed, and you have to rely on the internet, which is still up and down. You can't do school this way. If you want to rebuild Ukraine and you want it to be a vibrant, wild Ukrainian democracy, which is what we all want, you have to make sure that the kids have a real access to education. So amazing organizations, the Kiev School of Economics, another organization called Saved, they're going around and building bomb shelters now. In the face of the middle of the war, we will reopen, we will give kids education. My broader point is this, and this is sort of a message to the donor community. The donor community likes to give to organizations it knows. So do not give to the old dinosaurs. The old dinosaurs are the UN, the old international organizations that take up lots and lots of money. These guys are expensive and they don't know what they're doing in Ukraine. Ukrainians since 2014, as Nolan pointed out, have changed massively. The mentality has changed. The capacity is huge. The Ukrainian organizations know their needs. They can get stuff done way faster than the UN or any of these big dinosaurs can. They can absorb large amounts of money, and they know what Western transparency practices are. So as long as you give me the microphone, Peter, I'm going to say, go Ukrainian. And we know that the Ukrainian economy stinks, right? The economy has declined about 40%. Poverty is a real concern. Why on earth would you pump billions of dollars into Ukraine when you have an economy that needs to recover? So as much as we can in our development assistance, let's go Ukrainian.
Well, and our development assistance is routed through the World Bank, which is part of the UN system. So I detect a slight critique there, which we can perhaps flesh out as we go on. I'd also just, as an advertising point, note, since Bucha has fallen twice now in both Nolan and Melinda's comments, a few weeks ago, we managed to host the mayor and deputy mayor of Bucha. You can check it out at hudson.org and pull up the link. With that advertisement out of the way, paid for message, Paul Mazzaro, on to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter and Luke. Thanks for putting on this amazing event. It's always wonderful to come to Hudson. It feels like home away from home. I was actually a fellow here for a very short period of time. And I know Nate at the Kleptocracy Initiative and all sorts of other stuff. It's an incredible think tank. And I really think the work that's been done here, particularly Luke, your work was well ahead of the curve. And I guess that's kind of what I want to talk about today, forward looking, but also understanding the lessons of the last year. I think Nolan, you did an amazing job talking about Ukraine's resilience, and Ukraine will win this war. I think the only question is, sadly, how many Ukrainians will die? And I think that's the reason we need to surge assistance, is not because we doubt there will be a return to 1991 borders. There will be, but because the Ukrainians are losing their greatest generation at this moment, and we want to not allow that to happen. We need as many of these people to survive as possible. And I think, Melinda, you've spoken very well to to the spirit of Ukraine, the wild, vibrant democracy. And when I was there, it just, hits you in the face constantly. Every single Ukrainian who is completely committed to victory, completely committed to this idea of freedom. I mean, when I'm in Ukraine, and when I think about Ukraine, when I work on Ukraine, and when I tweet about Ukraine, I feel more American. I mean, it's like this is what it means. These people have embraced what we preach in an actual serious way, to the highest capacity of the human spirit. And I mean, it just blows me away, and it's why I've been so dedicated to this. But I want to talk about what we need to learn as the kind of DC policy community, because I don't think there's been enough self-reflection done on how we got this whole thing so extraordinarily wrong, or appreciation of how close we came to this World War III that everybody seems to be so worried about. I mean, in a very real way, Ukraine prevented a possible World War III by fighting, which nobody expected them to do. I mean, I want to remind everyone that we entered this ready to lose. Okay, I mean, our immediate response to this was to go in and try to evacuate President Zelensky. It was essentially to say, we're going to set up a government in exile. Ukraine is going to fall. That's going to be that. And then we're going to set up some sort of insurgency or something like that. I mean, the whole plan was half-baked, half-cocked. It didn't make sense. I mean, it didn't really appreciate Ukraine. And then beyond that, we didn't really appreciate Russia. I mean, we didn't understand the Russian military. We didn't understand the weakness of the Russian military. I mean, I reflect, those that know me know I sort of made my name doing the corruption fighting bit and kind of helping to frame corruption as a national security threat. And I think that the idea of Russia, the Russian MO, as using corruption to infiltrate the West and undermine institutions, that's all very correct, and that's true. But the big thing we missed around here, that if we just listen to the Ukrainians and listen to the Poles and listen to the peoples of the Baltic states and so on and so forth, we would have known, is that there's something much deeper happening in Russia, and something much more tragic in a sense. This is, centuries of an unrepentant colonial imperial power. And it kind of blows me away that we were unable to come to this conclusion after the invasion of Georgia. And then we were unable to come to the conclusion after the first invasion of Ukraine, when this really started. We were unable to come to the conclusion when they were assassinating people in London, in Berlin, in DC, probably. I mean, we were unable to come to this conclusion when they started undermining all of these international institutions everywhere. And still, we continued to hang to this notion that somehow we were going to engage with Russia, that we could turn Russia around, that Russia could be a net security provider for the region. I mean, when are we going to let go of this idea? I mean, it's been 3 decades, I mean, even now it feels like we still want to leave the door open. We still try to leave the door open. We don't want to label them a state sponsor of terror, right? We don't want to escalate the war, whatever that means. I mean, the whole escalation discussion in DC has been, circular, warmed over, never made any sense to begin with. I mean, we should have gotten the weapons to Ukraine immediately. We should have gotten the weapons to Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. That would have prevented the full-scale invasion, But our complete failure to deter Russia is something that we need self-examination and, yes, also accountability. We need to really look hard at ourselves and try to understand what happened here. And I think that there's kind of 2 ideas in my mind. I think one is we got very attached to this notion of great powers and the need to have great powers speak to one another, and great powers help to, tame one another's regions and things like that. And then the other, of course, is the thing that I've always talked about for a decade now, and that is corruption. And I think that these things, the role of foreign influence in this town and foreign corruption in this town, and not just this town, but geez, I mean, you go to Europe and you see this, in an even greater state, a place like Germany, where, I mean, thank goodness the Germans, after much prying and much pressure, have come around. But let's not forget that, I mean, until the bitter end, they were going to go through with this Nord Stream 2 deal. I mean, they were going to go through with essentially selling Ukraine out. The quick story that I think everyone's familiar with is when Ambassador Melnik in Germany went to Christian Lindner, the finance minister. He was told, I have nothing to negotiate with you because you guys aren't going to be sovereign in 3 days. I mean, it's just amazing the extent to which we were ready to just say, okay, you're done, whatever. So now a year later, I think the big lesson is we need to listen to Ukrainians. We need to listen to Poles. We need to listen to this region because they know what they're talking about. They know Russia better than we do, a lot better. And they have the answers and they have the strategies. So let's listen to them.
Thanks, Paul. Let me start with the two of you on Ukrainian civil society. Clearly, the Russians, during the winter and the period leading up to it, and continue on now, are targeting critical infrastructure in an attempt to break Ukraine's will. Both of you are suggesting, I mean, Nolan very explicitly so, and I think it's an implication of your remarks as well, Melinda, that in fact morale is high. The Ukrainians have withstood this. And the question I have is, perhaps it's a broader theoretical one, but you can address the Ukrainian context. What leads a peoples in the wake of extreme violence to resist versus resign themselves to their fate? What is it that in the Blitz, for example, World War II, but now also in the Ukrainian case with the Russians, led the Ukrainians to choose one direction rather than another? I mean, I'm sure the Kremlin had its own rationale, thought this would work,
Yeah.
but it didn't. I mean, how should we think about that, especially as we not only approach the anniversary, but look to the months ahead, because this strategy continues. Nolan, maybe you want to go first.
Well, I think, again, Ukrainians have been fighting for their freedom since 2014. And then when the war began, like I mentioned, it became a fight for their survival. And so I think, as after we saw the atrocities that were committed around Kyiv, about a month into the war, we understood what was going on. For many Ukrainians, that flipped a switch in their mind that there's no turning back. This is our fight for our country's continued statehood. But it was really incredible in those weeks leading up to the invasion. I was out there almost every day with these groups of civilians of all ages. I mean, men up to 70s, teenagers, training for combat, training to defend their street corner, right? Training to go to war and stare down a Russian tank. And I remember being out there, watching them run around in the snow, a lot of it with the Georgian National Legion. They were training a lot of civilians. And I was looking at them, and I was just like, are they really going to do it? When it comes down to it, when there's a Russian tank rolling down your street, are you really going to have the courage to step out and throw a Molotov cocktail at it, to shoot back? And they did. And I think that desire to fight is born out of a commitment to freedom and democracy. And the fact that among Ukrainians, particularly the millennial generation, which gets a bad rap in our society, but among the millennials, my wife included, they have such a clear vision of the life they want. My wife would tell me when the Yanukovych backed out of the EU Association Agreement, which sparked the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, how betrayed she felt and how upset and angry all her friends were that they don't want to go back to Russia. They want to be free. They want to be a democracy in a part of the West. And so they have this very clear understanding of what they want. And I think that fuels their desire to stand up and fight for their freedom. They believe that freedom is something worth fighting for. But, it takes an unbelievable amount of courage to actually walk toward the sounds of gunfire and to fight. And, it was quite remarkable to see these people walk that walk. But during the strategic missile campaign, I would say without a doubt, that has reinforced the will of the civilian population to resist. And you look at me, and it's not just anecdotally, but you look at the poll numbers as the war goes on, it's ticking upward. The percentage of Ukrainians who don't want to make any concessions, they want to win this thing. And they understand, like I alluded to earlier, as well as the ambassador, this isn't about redrawing the map or getting back their land. It's about liberating their people. And we see it, in Kherson and Mariupol and Izium, Bucha, Irpin, what Russia is doing. And so this is a war to liberate the Ukrainians who are living under occupation and to ensure that Ukraine continues to exist as a sovereign nation.
So I disagree with this man. People who knew Ukraine knew that they would resist. But just to riff off of Paul for a minute, there's not enough people in this town who know Ukraine. We go to Georgetown, George Washington, and we're in Russian studies programs, and we study Russian, and we learn about, we learn to venerate Russian culture. Well, you know what? It's time to open more Ukrainian studies programs. It's time to have more Georgian studies programs, and move beyond that very narrow way of looking at it. Two people were.
We don't disagree. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Oh, okay, good. So there were two people who got the strength of the Ukrainian military right. outside of the U.S. government, and they're not very well known. You become a sexy researcher by knowing the Russian military. That's the big boy in town, the Chinese and the Russian, the great power theme that he hit on. So I think we need more funding to study Ukraine and have greater expertise. I don't have much to add beyond a joke or two. So I would say that I knew that the Ukrainians would resist because it's in their DNA. It goes back far beyond the Euromaidan, right? And it's they remember the Holodomor. This is a living memory to them. And there's always this deep fear that the Russians were going to come and try to take over their country, and it was only a matter of time. You scratch, and you find that sentiment very deeply. Have they gotten through it mentally? This is a question I ask my friends. So they say, thank God for the warm winter. This was not a very hard winter. The Germans didn't collapse. If it had been a cold winter, we're not so sure. And they use humor. And Nolan knows this from living there. So I'll call them and say, my God, how do you go up 14 stories all the time? And they say, Vladimir Putin wants us to have the best legs in Europe.
Paul, let me come to you on your area of specialty, which is kleptocracy. And obviously, the outbreak of the war has revealed the Russian armed forces to be something of a hollow force. That may be overstating it, but clearly rife with graft and grift and thieving and pilfering and all the rest. Given that this is to be an unavoidable conclusion, even at Putin's level now, that his generals have been stealing or that the force is somewhat hollow, do you see any evidence that the Russian armed forces have made adjustments? They've moved to a war footing. Have they taken on some of the kleptocracy just for the pure sake of efficiency and trying to win this war? Or are we still on the same course that we were on a year ago today?
I honestly see no evidence that it's changed at all. I mean, it's still fighting very much the same way. I mean, it's the Mobics that are the problem, right? I mean, Russia is defaulted down to just throwing humans at the problem, and I mean, these individuals are not trained, they're not well armed. There's nothing. I mean, but they remain a threat. I mean, it's not like they're not a threat. In one sense, they're trying to exhaust the psyche of Ukrainian defenders who are fewer in number, of course, are better trained and have more experience, and but I mean it's just a case of, does Russia have more warm bodies than Ukraine has ammo? And it's a really sick calculus, but that's exactly, I mean, this is the whole thing, is Ukraine is a democracy where the individual human life matters, and Russia's willing to just throw these individuals in the meat grinder. But has there been any different? No, I mean Putin's regime still runs off kleptocracy. Nothing has changed about the manner in which, I mean, it's become more oppressive, I suppose, than it was previously. But it's the same thing it's always been. I mean, I've sometimes said, like, I mean, the Russia is dangerous asymmetrically, but now we know that the Russian military is not what we thought it was. I mean, they remain, though, dangerous asymmetrically. That is to say, their corruption in the West has been dangerous and has shown itself to be dangerous, and their ability to exert foreign influence has been diminished pretty significantly because now their reputation has been so destroyed, but is still there.
If you have a question, please alert me. I'll ask one or two more questions, and then I'll come to the audience. But I'll take names, as it were, as we go. I'll stick with you, Paul, with a follow-up question. You were totally dismissive of the escalation argument, but for some people out there, they just put one and one together and say, if you give weapons to the Ukrainians, it will cause Putin to escalate, and they fear nuclear detonation, among other things. I agree with you that I think we're looking at escalation in the wrong way. In fact, I think escalation is more a product of Putin's perceptions of Western weakness rather than any dynamic on the battlefield. Don't steal my answer. But why so dismissive? I mean, why do you have no empathy with people who make those arguments? What do you say?
I have zero. I think a lot of some of it's in bad faith. I mean, absolutely, it's from people who want to use it to push Russia's perspective. I mean, there's a reason that Putin is out every single day making threats about nuclear weapons. I mean, some of it is this notion of the adult in the room, being the responsible statesman that has to think about these things. Both the notions are goofy in my view. I mean, I think that they completely overplay the risk. And I think that we've really come to recognize that. Look, I mean, when people say escalation, what they mean is the use of nuclear weapons. You know, I mean, they're not worried about, obviously they're not worried about Ukrainian lives, because if they were, we would have long since given more weapons to Ukraine, given that Russia is engaging in daily terrorist attacks against Ukrainians and has already wiped Mariupol off the face of the earth and so on and so forth. So Russia continues to escalate conventionally. So that's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is the use of nuclear weapons. And Russia doesn't use nuclear weapons because we have nuclear weapons. I mean, this is just bottom line standard, nuclear deterrence theory. I mean, they're not going to use nuclear weapons because we send Bradleys. They're not going to use nuclear weapons because we send javelins. They're not going to use it doesn't make any sense, So it's all hollow. It's all a way to get us to be scared, which is what Russia has done. They put this fear in our heads. They want to freeze us through fear, through constantly making these threats and blah blah blah. You have to be responsible, blah blah. You have to treat us like you treat a normal state. And this is exactly our problem: is we have, and we shouldn't have. Russia is a fascistic mafia state. It's not deserving of equal representation. And it's not like this is a crazy idea. Obviously, we did not treat the Soviet Union with any sort of equal representation in the international system. So they should absolutely be reduced in their stature to pariah state or rogue state, state sponsor of terror, whatever you want to call it.
Nolan, feel free to follow up on that if you like, but I have another question for you too, and that is, do you see any evidence in your conversations with Ukrainian commanders and on the ground that there is any Russian adaptation to learning ongoing? Is this just an iterative Stalinist process of throwing waves at the front lines and hoping to break through, or are they unable, given their hierarchical setup, to make changes, or do you think that in the first year and going forward we might see some improvements in the Russian performance?
There definitely have been adaptations and learning on the Russian side. But like what Commander Mamuka mentioned, the lion's share of the trained professional Russian army has either been destroyed or deeply wounded in this first phase of the war. So if there are adaptations, if they are learning what tactics and techniques they can use to be more effective against the Ukrainians, they don't necessarily have the personnel who can carry out those changes. So I think the Russian army, estimates over half their tank fleet has been destroyed in the first half of this war, and their air force, which we all thought was going to run rampant over the Ukrainian air force, is proven to be largely ineffective. Ukraine still has control over most of its skies, or is at least able to push out the Russians from. We don't have bombers flying over Kyiv, right? Russia's using Iranian drones and cruise missiles to hit Kyiv. So I think that the Russians are learning, but their tactic, like Paul was saying, they're trying to outpace the amount of ammunition that Ukraine has with the amount of bodies that Russia is pumping at this war, and they think that's their path to success. But again, in a war of attrition, Russia is basically banking on the notion that the Ukrainian nation's will to resist will collapse before the Russian army collapses. And to me, it seems like this Pyrrhic kamikaze attempt by the Russians to secure some glimmer of success. But I think at some point, the command structure and the morale within the Russian army will collapse just by virtue of the fighting resistance of the Ukrainians, but also the inhuman treatment of Russian commanders toward their troops. And there's lots of reports of Soviet-style blocking units out there arresting, in some instances, shooting Russian soldiers who are trying to desert. So it's a very brutal campaign waged by the Russians. They initially thought they could execute some sort of very sophisticated strike campaign and roll into Kyiv and decapitate the government. And when that didn't work, their lesson is their greatest asset is just this reserve of manpower that they can pump at the war. As far as escalation goes, I think as we incrementally escalate, we're basically just trying to stave off Ukraine's defeat. And by doing that in these fits and starts, we're allowing Russia to then counter-escalate. We're giving them the time to mobilize, to get these troops to the front lines. If we're in this to win it, we got to escalate massively, like quickly, give Ukraine everything they need to win this, like I said, as quickly as possible. Because the greatest sin in any war, I believe, is to allow it to drag on for decades. And so we need to make sure that this ends as quickly as possible and basically not give Russia the time to counter-escalate.
Go ahead. Let me just ask a question, but you can wrap in your comments there as well. You're opening in April this medical center in Lviv that's based on visible wounds. When I was in Ukraine, one of the big stark warnings was the massive sort of invisible mental health problems that are going to be coming out of this war. Can you just address kind of the state of society writ large? I mean, what are the medical dimensions of all of this?
Thanks for that question. So PTSD is a huge problem. I don't have the best number, and I don't think anyone has a really accurate number. It's an issue that the First Lady cares about deeply and is trying to address. PTSD treatment is one of the treatments that we will provide. So we will be doing PTSD treatment. We'll be doing prosthetics, world-class prosthetics, reconstructive surgery, because Nolan knows this from being out with the guys, but many of the injuries are super complex, and it's not just an arm. It's arms and legs and facial reconstruction surgery that's needed. So it's a whole complete package. And getting a guy or gal back into sort of working order is really expensive, but it's much cheaper to do it in Ukraine and be closer to home. And it's not just building people back to life; it's the mental connection as well. So your body won't accept a prosthetic device unless you're psychologically ready for it. So it's really important to have the rehabilitation and the PTSD treatment as well. So your body is ready for it and you can get back to work. And it's also important to have jobs, right? Again, the Ukrainian economy has dropped by 40%. We got to get people back to work if we're going to rebuild Ukraine. So it has to be sort of a very complete package.
On the subject of PTSD, I think it's important to note now that we're in this full-scale war that affects every corner of Ukrainian life, there's a sense of nationwide sort of commitment to the war effort, that everybody has a stake in what's going on. Before February 24th last year, as a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, I actually had a lot of commonality with the Ukrainian veterans coming back from the front lines in the Donbass. It was a very strict, limited war along a trench line. And they come back to their homes, sometimes just an hour away from the front lines, and people are going about their lives, eating fast food, just living their normal life. And there is this sense of like almost being a foreigner in your own country and just feeling out of place and feeling like the most civilians just don't understand what you went through. And it just didn't feel like it was a nationwide commitment to the war effort before February 24th. That's changed.
Completely.
Now the entire nation, every Ukrainian, I guarantee, knows somebody who's been killed in combat. Their lives have been affected in some way. They've lost their jobs. They're driving through military checkpoints every day. They hear the air raid alerts. Everybody's in this together. And so I truly believe that the problem of post-traumatic stress, while many people will be mentally wounded by the war, I feel like the recovery process from that will actually be assisted by the fact that anybody you look in their eyes and you're like, we went through that together. And I think that will help. Yeah.
Do you mind if I follow up on his point? So I think everyone in this room agrees time is of the essence. The Europeans are finally saying it as loudly as possible too. But let's dig in for a minute and ask, what does that mean? I have three things on my list, Peter, and this is not exclusive, but I would love to see President Biden this week stand up and say, look, I stuck my neck out. I went to Kiev. This is an enormous priority, and I need you Americans to keep giving and keep sacrificing. So, if I'm going to evaluate him, I give him a flat B. Paul will probably give him a B minus. But he did a lot right. But he hasn't explained to Americans why a country 5,000 miles away matters and why they should continue to pay high prices at the pump. So give the American people a better explanation. There's two other things we need to do. This was the really hard one. We haven't solved Ukraine's security dilemma. So even if we give them all the weapons they want, even in Paul's greatest dream, we send them as many F-16s as we possibly can. That would right. We still haven't solved the security dilemma. They have an open wound there, and until we solve that, this is going to happen again and again. And one thing that I sense, Nolan, I'd be curious if you sense this too in my conversations with Ukrainian, is there's a growing sense of anger that the West, yes, you've given us a lot of things, but you haven't solved the fundamental problem. And it takes 1 second for them to go back to the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. And I tell them, look, that argument doesn't hold a lot of weight. I'm very sorry, but they are right. We haven't solved it. And then the other issue is, if they're going to win it, and this is a race to resupply, what the heck are we doing with ammunition? We need a long-term plan. Let's make it happen. Let's stop talking about it.
Okay, that's great. Well, then that takes me to a question for all three of you. And if we have time, I'll take questions, but I don't see any hands yet. So, well, there's one. Two questions for each of you. The first is, what does Ukraine need? We keep talking about what the Ukrainians need. And secondly, if you can prognosticate, where is this year heading? By your best guesses, by your lights, where do you think the conflict is heading in the coming months, at least as far as you can see? Paul, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, right now it's F-16s and ATACMS, and I do tweet that like every day. But that's where we're at, right? I mean, it's opening up these new capabilities, and I've always kind of been of the philosophy of give Ukraine what they ask for, and that's what they're asking for right now. So I think that's the thing. Obviously, we need to make good on some of these deliveries we've said we're going to make, like the tanks haven't arrived yet, right? So there's stuff that needs to like go in large supply. There's also stuff that like I think they need that we haven't, they might not be asking for because it might not be a big enough ask. Things like medical supplies, where like, okay, yeah, the MOD is not going to come up and say, yeah, we need a lot of medical supplies, because they want to keep asking for F-16s and ATACMS, but they do need medical supplies, a lot of medical supplies. And they need to, the one thing that Ukraine can't get any more of, well, not without a lot of effort, I guess, in time, is Ukrainians. So it's like we got to make sure that Ukrainians are staying alive, and that if you're wounded in the field, that we can take you to a field hospital right away, and you can like all this kind of stuff is really important. So I'd like to see that kind of stuff arrive. And I guess the final thing is, Starlink is a lot more important to Ukrainian advances, I think, than people realize. So when we've got this, red-pilled, whacked out tech entrepreneur coming on Twitter, the platform he owns every day, to talk about how he needs to de-escalate the war and be the savior of mankind and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this is no good. Starlink is really important. So we need to obviously you can't, you free market, it's his company, but we can put pressure on him, and we can explain to him, and we can try to figure out how we can ensure that Starlink bandwidth isn't being limited. Now, and apparently it worked there to get Namuka in here today. That was actually really smooth. Congrats, Luke. But where is it going to head? I mean, I think that when Ukraine retakes, everything is Crimea, which is why I think the next panel is so important. If Melitopol and Mariupol are retaken, which I think is the spring offensive. I mean, I don't know. I don't have any more information than anybody else has. But if that's the case, and you get into range of the Crimean Bridge and blow up the Crimean Bridge, then Crimea basically falls on its own. It can't be resupplied. There's no way in there. You just starve it out. And if Crimea falls, in my view, that undermines basically the entire legitimacy of the Putin regime. You're going to have a lot more internal dissent in Russia. A lot of people talk today about a Prigozhin Shoigu or Kadyrovite, whatever it will be, civil war. I have no idea what's going to happen within Russia. Nobody does. But I'll say that I think it makes it more likely that Russia eventually says, okay, well, if we don't even have Crimea now, then what's the point of this? That's my view.
All right, Paul thinks Crimea is going to fall and Putin is history. I believe that's
this year or next year, right?
Yeah. Next few months.
Oh my God.
Probably not the wildest prediction he's made. Belinda, up to you.
A good thing that this isn't the Old Testament period where they cut off prophets who make wrong predictions, right?
Yeah, good thing.
Yeah.
Rather, it's DC where you can just say whatever you want all the time.
So same on the weapons systems, but the part that doesn't get enough play is budget support. So the U.S. government actually did something amazing last year. I don't like spending taxpayer dollars very much, but I'm proud to be a taxpayer. So we gave $9 billion with a B to Ukraine, and it was to keep paying pensions to grandmas, to keep the railways alive, to keep the state afloat, to keep the hospitals open. Mm-hmm. We can give Ukraine all the beautiful weapon systems in the world, but without this money, it becomes Afghanistan. and they lose. So it's the weapon systems and it's the budget support. So keep the budget support coming, and we need a big, beautiful IMF package to keep Ukraine afloat. So focus on both. And I think he's right on Starlink. I think we can also be doing be a little bit more aggressive with our intelligence sharing as well, and help them a little bit more with targeting as things get serious with the spring offensive. But the thing I'm really worried about, Peter, is next winter. Everyone is still gung ho. The Western coalition is hanging together very cohesively. But I'm worried about Congress too. There's going to be new assistance packages. Paul can say more about this in the summer. And the right is a cause for concern. But there is optimistic news. If you look at Gallup, it says that 65% of Americans fully support the United States enabling Ukraine to retake its territory, even if that extends the conflict. It was 65% this year. It was 65% last year. There is not Ukraine fatigue in this country.
Well, one thing I think that's underappreciated is that the European effort to fill up their natural gas storages last year took place with Russian gas.
Yep.
And that is now offline. And so it's a lot more difficult, I think, to refill. And of course, there was a mild winter this year as well. Nolan?
Yeah, on the gas, I mean, it is surprising, though, that Russian gas is still flowing through Ukrainian pipelines to clients in Europe, which is crazy to think that there's still a business relationship going on there. As far as what weapons Ukraine needs, really nothing different, although I would add, I mean, F-16s, I'm totally on board. Big argument a year ago is, well, it takes a year to train them. Here we are, right? And the air war has really been a stalemate since the beginning. And if Ukraine had the ability to suppression of enemy air defenses, to take out some of those Russian air defenses and clear the way for more medevac flights, attack helicopters, like it would be a game changer for the Ukrainians. And I talk to Ukrainian fighter pilots frequently. They all say, and these are guys who've come to the United States, done exercises with Ukrainian or American jets. They understand the systems. They understand the realities of getting trained on an F-16, and it would be a game changer. Like, for example, an F-16 can fire a missile and have that missile independently track its target without the fighter jet having to keep its radar. Right now, the MiG-29s, you got to keep your radar pointed at the enemy jet until it impacts, which leaves you much more vulnerable. Something as simple as that would give the Ukrainians a huge advantage in the air war. But artillery ammunition is essential right now. That is the lifeblood of this conflict. We've got to keep funneling that to Ukraine so they can sustain their war effort. When it comes to something like attack AMs or even an F-16, I remember from my service as a pilot in Afghanistan and Iraq, the importance of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. That could be unmanned drones out there providing real-time information, looking at a place to increase Ukraine's ability, their intelligence assets and their access to American intelligence, but also give them the tools, like a predator, unarmed predator drone maybe, or something like that. They can go out there and loiter and find targets for some of these more precise weapons that I hope that we give them. And you hit on this, and it's something I really want to say too, is we have to keep the economy afloat for the war to sustain. This war is also being fought on the home front. Civilian morale has to sustain itself. And as long as we keep the lights on, so to speak, in Ukraine, that's half the battle, in my opinion, is to keep the country functioning as a viable modern society and state is really, really important. I remember during the winter, U.S. aid came in and was repairing gas pipelines and setting up generators around the city. And that had a big impact on people. And it really allowed to see the support, but also in a practical perspective, to enjoy utilities that allow them to survive the winter. As far as the next step, I think Russia's going to keep grinding on. And I think in the long run, whether it happens this year or next, I think that Russia will see a morale collapse within its military. And when that happens, Ukrainians are going to rout them and Ukraine is going to win. I think Russia cannot sustain its level of losses right now, the level of humiliation. I think you see this in these military bloggers in Russia. They just, how is Ukraine doing this? How is this possible? I thought they were a bunch of like backwoods people who couldn't mount a defense. And it's just, we are constantly crushing their dreams and their stereotypes. And the more we do that, the more successful Ukraine is. I think they have a better chance of winning in as short as time as possible.
For a second commercial break, if you're interested in the technical analysis of these weapon systems and a weekly update on what's happening in the war, my colleague Chan Kasapoulou every Wednesday puts out a newsletter. The third edition comes out this week. I urge you all to go to hudson.org and sign up for it. Yes, sir. We'll take one question and then we'll wrap and take a break for the next panel.
Thank you. Doug Brooks with FDI Solutions. So last year we had the Kharkiv offensive, and that seemed to be sort of light at the end of the tunnel. We saw a lot of movement and everything, and since then it's dropped into this war of attrition, which is really slow and brutal. It really seems like maybe what we need is a Kremlin coup. Are we seeing any open windows at the Kremlin that somebody might fall out anytime soon? Are we seeing any movement there that might change things radically on that side, which I think would really shorten the war?
I think sadly, I mean, I think one thing we've realized, for example, I remember right before the full-scale war began, a very common argument I heard from some think tankers here in DC was like, oh, the propaganda groundwork has not been laid on the Russian people to support this. We don't see this like acute spike in propaganda. What we didn't get, there's been decades of indoctrination and brainwashing in Russia. My wife, half her family lives in Russia, and they believe crazy things about the biolabs and all that stuff. And so I'm a little bit pessimistic about a coup or revolution in Russia because I believe that most Russians, at least the ones who haven't fled, you know, they either support the war or they're tacitly accepting of it. So I think the more likely scenario, I think, is a collapse within the Russian army, just a morale collapse, a chain of command collapse, a mutiny or something like that, more related to people just getting tired of dying. But I think within Russia, my personal take, I'd be a little more pessimistic about somebody stepping in and booting Putin and ending the war, just because I think that the war is generally popular among young Russian people.
Linda, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
I wouldn't write Vladimir Putin's obituary yet.
all right, I think we heard Paul's answer in the last section, so I'll just say thanks for joining us for this panel. We're going to take an intermission of about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll be back with the discussion on Crimea featuring Ben Hodges, former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, Maria Tomak, head of the Crimea Platform Department at the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and our very own Brian Clark, whom you may know as the director of our Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. Thanks so much to our panelists. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all, especially if you're tuning in at home, in about 15 minutes.
Good morning, ladies and final panel discussion for our event today, looking at the situation in Ukraine in 2023. We have a very distinguished and experienced panel today that I'll be introducing in a moment. I just wanted to first, though, take an opportunity to thank the Hudson events team and our tech team to their hard work putting together this event. I know some were here over the weekend. And if you want to ever stress out your tech guy, tell him you want to incorporate as part of your event a live stream with a commander on the front lines of a war zone. that will do the job. But it all worked out. It all went out without a hitch. So I want to thank my Hudson colleagues here for their hard work. The focus of this panel is on the military situation in 2023 and specifically Crimea. As our soon-to-be speaker, Ben Hodges, has been saying, Crimea is, in his words, decisive terrain in this conflict. I would also say it's a decisive terrain in the great power competition that we face around the world. Russia has used Crimea as a springboard to launch its operations in places like Libya and Syria. And of course, for as long as Russia controls and illegally occupies Crimea, Ukraine will never be safe. So that is why we are focusing specifically on this issue today in this final panel of this event. Now, I'll introduce the three speakers. Then we'll go do the rounds, and then we can open it up to Q&A. Our first speaker will be Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges. He really needs no introduction. Former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, and currently now a senior advisor at Human Rights First, which is a leading international human rights organization that has been around since, I believe, the late 70s. I think 78, 79 it was founded. Our second speaker is Maria Tomak. She is the head of the Crimea Platform Department at the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Maria has, before taking on this role, Maria has had a very distinguished and courageous career focusing on human rights and documenting evidence of Russia's war crimes and crimes against humanity. And she is, in her current role, is focused with a laser-like focus on the situation in Crimea. And then last but not least, my dear colleague, Brian Clark, who's a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute. Brian and his team has done amazing work analyzing some of the more technical aspects of the war in Ukraine, analyzing what platforms are needed, what systems are needed, really focused on the capabilities that the Ukrainians need. Oftentimes we talk in terms of equipment platform names like Patriot or Abrams, but him and his team, they dive deeper and they talk about what capability needs to be delivered to Ukraine and how to best get that to Ukraine. So with that, I'll kick it off with Ben. Thanks Ben for joining us live from Germany in your very, very busy schedule this week.
Luke, thank you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. And you've already said the most important thing is that Crimea is decisive. The Donbass is important, but if Ukrainian forces were to liberate all of Donbass right now, that would not necessarily change the outcome of the conflict or the long-term future. Crimea will, and I think that if Ukraine is able to liberate Crimea, which is feasible this year, by the end of the summer, in fact, if we do certain things, then Donbass will follow. Why do I think Crimea is decisive? Obviously, as long as Russian forces occupy Crimea, they'll be able to use it as a launching pad for the next attacks. So if there was some sort of peace settlement or agreement where Russia was allowed to keep Crimea, then Ukraine would never be safe because Russia would be able to use it for the Black Sea Fleet, their Air Force, logistics, other things, and it would be the place from which they would start the next iteration of this war, because surely that's what they'll do. They will wait 2 or 3 years for us to lose interest. They'll repair the mistakes and the things they did wrong this time, and then it will be game on again. So that's part of the reason I think it's decisive. It's also decisive, and by the way, because we have not given kilometers, the Gimler's rocket that's fired from HIMARS, Crimea is in effect sanctuary for Russian forces even today. It's also decisive because I think it will be impossible for Ukraine to rebuild its economy as long as Russia controls Crimea. Obviously, they would not allow Ukrainian vessels to go in and out of the Azov Sea. So even if Mariupol and Verdansk are liberated, and they will eventually, but even if once they're liberated, Russia will control the entry and access to Azov Sea, just as they did back in 2019 when they intercepted or attacked 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels attempting to head towards the Kerch Straits. So that part of Ukraine's economy will never get going again. And of course, this is an economy that depends on export of grain, iron ore, fresh rare earth materials, and so on. And then, of course, Odessa. Already, there are more than 100 ships loaded with grain sitting in and around Odessa, waiting to exit through the straits. And they can't because of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and this agreement that's in place requiring Russian inspectors to approve each vessel before it can go. So this is only possible because of Russia's ability to operate out of Sevastopol. And then, of course, Russia will continue to make claims for exclusive economic zone around Crimea, which means Ukraine would not be able to explore for and exploit the gas reserves that we all know are underneath the Black Sea. So it's decisive for those reasons, and that's why it's impossible to imagine any sort of scenario where Russia is allowed to keep. No, I shouldn't say it that way. Of course, you can imagine it, but I cannot imagine that we would want Ukraine to have to accept Crimea as a belonging to Russia in any sort of circumstances. Now, so what do we do about that? First of all, we have got to get clarity on what our strategic objectives are for this conflict. There are still too many senior people, including our own vice president, who at the Munich Security Conference said, that basically she said, we're going to stick with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Well, what does that mean? I mean, what is it? We have got to hear from the president, the vice president, the secretary of defense and state that our strategic objective is for Ukraine to win. What does win mean? Total restoration of all Ukrainian sovereign territory. And of course, immediately someone would say, does that mean Crimea? Well, yeah, it's like Florida is part of America. Bavaria is part of Germany. So we have to deal with this mindset that people think that somehow Crimea has a special sort of status. It doesn't. It's sovereign territory of Ukraine. So winning means sovereignty of all Ukrainian territory. It also means bringing back the thousands of Ukrainian children who have been deported, bring them back home. It means accountability for Russian war crimes. It means an ironclad security guarantee. Nobody's going to invest in a Marshall Plan if there's not an ironclad security guarantee for Ukraine, which means as long as Russia occupies Crimea, there will not be a Marshall Plan. There will be no serious investment in Ukraine as long as Russia occupies Crimea. That's a problem not only for Ukraine, that's a problem for Europe, because that means probably 4 million or more refugees will continue to live here in Germany or Poland or other places in Europe. So what's needed? How do we do this? First of all, of course, all of you know, if you listen to this, you already are very familiar with Ukrainian geography. There really are only 2 landlines of communication into Crimea. One goes over the Kerch Bridge, which has already been severely damaged. I would anticipate that Ukrainian General Staff will revisit that bridge when the time is right. And we want to keep the Russians from being able to repair that bridge. The other is the so-called land bridge that connects Crimea to Russia via Melitopol and Mariupol, and then into Rostov. So you have to isolate Crimea first, and you do that with long-range precision strike capability that keeps repair crews off the Kerch Bridge, and which can begin to sever the land bridge by knocking out bridges around Melitopol and other places along that route. And then you further isolate it with a what I anticipate will happen probably late spring, early summer, the next Ukrainian counteroffensive that will be an armored force that will attack on a narrow front, penetrating Russian defenses in the direction of Melitopol. That's where they're going to go, I believe. What's happening around Bakhmut is terrible fire, limiting what Russia's able to do despite months of thousands of Russian casualties and continuous effort. They're able to do that with largely territorial defense force, National Guard units, so that they can preserve and build up this armored force, which I anticipate will be somewhere between 3 and 6 armored brigades that, with mechanized infantry, tanks, self-propelled artillery, and armored engineers, would be an adequate force to penetrate Russia's linear defenses. Once that's done, then you can start bringing up the long-range precision weapons close enough where they begin to make the Crimean Peninsula untenable for Russian forces. When precision weapons start landing inside Sevastopol, the Russian Black Sea Fleet will have to relocate to Novorossiysk or somewhere else. Same thing for the large logistics hub at Zhankoy, the Russian air base at Saki, and a dozen or so other places where the Russians have facilities on the Crimean Peninsula. This can all happen by this summer if we decide we want Ukraine to win and if we deliver what they need, which is long-range precision strike. Now, that could be F-16s, that could be ATACMs, that could be ground-launched small-diameter bombs, it could be Gray Eagle drones. There are various other solutions for long-range strike, but that to me is the priority capability that's required. The last thing I'll say, of course, is people have heart attacks when you say, got to get Crimea. Got to get Crimea. They'll say, oh, wait, won't that make the Kremlin angry? Isn't it special? Won't that cross a red line? Isn't that something where the Russians would use a nuclear weapon? Yes, it'll make them angry. Yes, they think it's special. No, they won't use a nuclear weapon. And we're the ones that are putting red lines against ourselves. We are deterring ourselves. We've been doing it for an entire year. We need to stop this. I think there is almost zero chance Russia would use a nuclear weapon if we were to enable Ukraine to liberate it. I think the Russians believe President Biden that there would in fact be catastrophic consequences for them if they use a nuclear weapon. They clearly are not going to use a strategic nuclear weapon. So the only sort of choice is a tactical nuclear weapon, which offers no advantage. It won't change anything on the ground. It might rubble more towns and it will kill innocent people. But from a purely operational standpoint, it gives them no advantage at all. And so I think as I try to imagine how they would think about this, of course, I don't assume that the Kremlin uses Western logic, but there's no positive outcome for them in any scenario. So this is why I think those Russian nuclear weapons are really most effective when they don't actually use them, because they can see that we will continue to deter ourselves. Luke, over to you, sir.
Thanks for that fantastic overview. A lot of food for thought there. I love the optimism. I completely agree with you. When you said that this summer the Ukrainians can liberate Crimea if we decide we want them to win, that is so crucial. We have to start wanting Ukraine to win more than we just hope that Russia is going to lose, and we have to start arming and planning that way. I see. Do we have our next? Is our next speaker up? Yeah, perfect. All right, Maria. Thank you again for joining us. You just heard what Ben had to say. As the head of the Crimea Platform Department, what is your take? What are your opinions about the situation in Crimea and the prospects of a full liberation of Crimea in the near future?
Thank you so much. Good evening or good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for having me at this panel, and it's an honor to be a part of this panel with such distinguished speakers. Although I'm not an expert in military issues, I'm rather would be specializing in humanitarian issues. And indeed, prior to shifting to working for the